Good evening. I'm David Kataforis, professor and chair of art history at the University of Kansas. I'm speaking to you today from Lawrence, Kansas, which resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This acknowledgement recognizes Native Americans as traditional guardians of the land and the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm honored to introduce this academic year's Franklin Murphy Distinguished Alumni Lecturer, Robert Mowry. I'll provide a brief overview of his distinguished career and invite you to read more about his biography in the current edition of the Art History Department newsletter, which is posted on our department website. Mr. Mowry earned his BA and MA in art history from the University of Kansas and passed his doctoral exams in 1975. His career began with work as a curatorial assistant in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. He was appointed assistant curator of Oriental art at the Harvard Art Museums, then held the post of curator of Asian art at the Asia Society, and finally worked as associate curator of Chinese art and curator of Chinese art at the Harvard Art Museums, where he retired as the Alan J. Dworsky Curator of Chinese Art Emeritus in 2013. He is currently employed as senior consultant in Chinese and Korean art at the auction house Christie's. Mr. Mowry is the recipient of numerous international grants and has an extensive list of publications. Major works include Hare's Fur, Tortoiseshell, and Partridge Feathers, Chinese brown and black glazed ceramics, 400 to 1400, published in 1996, and World Within Words, Chinese Scholars' Rocks from the Richard Rosenblum collection from 1997. He's also the editor of A Tradition Redefined, Modern Contemporary Chinese Ink Paintings from the Jutsing Li collection, 1950 to 2000, which was published in 2007. Mr. Mowry will entertain questions after his lecture this evening, so please type your questions in the chat on YouTube. The question and answer will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Amy McNair. So I'm now happy to turn the screen over to Robert Mowry, who will speak on Collected Stones, the Essence of the Chinese Landscape.
Good evening, David, and good evening to all of you who have joined this program. Thank you for doing so. I too once lived in Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in Lawrence this evening. I would love to be able to give the lecture in person, but given the public health circumstances, we're lucky to be able to connect and engage via Zoom and YouTube. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and it's a signal honor to have been invited to give the Franklin Murphy lecture. I met and came to know, at least in passing, Franklin Murphy many years ago. Many of you know he was chancellor of the University of Kansas from 1951 to 1960, certainly before my years there, but he remained a close affiliation with the university, and he was very close to Marilyn Stockstead, whose name is familiar to all of you, who had been chairman of the art history department, director of the museum at the University of Kansas, and a dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Because of their friendship, Franklin Murphy paid frequent visits to the University of Kansas over the years. And during my years there as a graduate student, Marilyn produced me to him on a couple of occasions when he passed through. Later, that is to say in the early 1990s, in his waning years, mutual friends in Los Angeles invited me to join them and him for dinner on a couple of occasions. So I was able to spend some time with him, knowing how much he did for the University of Kansas, how much he did for higher education, and particularly how much he did for the arts. It's a special privilege for me to have been invited to give the Franklin Murphy lecture. Now, this evening, I will speak on Chinese collected rocks, the essence of Chinese painting. A famous contemporary painter whom many of you probably know, or at least you know his works, Leo Dan, once described in a published interview Chinese rocks as the stem cells of Chinese landscape painting, which is the equivalent of what I said of the essence of Chinese landscape painting. Now, there are basically two types of rocks, and we'll see many of them through the course of this lecture. There are garden rocks, as you see in this particular slide, and there are scholars' rocks, as they are generally known, which are small, which are meant to be seen indoors in the confines of the scholar's studio. Now, one thing people often ask, what is the meaning of these rocks? Well, basically, these are abstract sculptures. One might think of a Henry Moore or an Alberto Giacometti, for example. They're in that particular realm. They have representational overtones, but they're basically abstract works of art. Now, for those who seek meaning, of course, it depends upon the shape of the particular rock, whether a garden rock or a scholar's rock. Many of them suggest landscapes, as this one suggests a towering peak. Others might suggest a dancing figure or a particular animal. Now, while this might not look like a peak from the Rocky Mountains, when we put it in the context of Chinese painting, and if we compare it with this wonderful 18th century scroll in the Nelson Atkins Museum by Yuan Zhang, you'll see the close similarity between the painting and the rock. I doubt that Yuan Zhang ever saw this particular rock, but given that the painting and the rock are virtually mirror images of each other, you see this close connection that can exist, doesn't always exist, but can exist between rocks and paintings. Or we look at this rock, probably from the 19th century, in a sea green hornblende stone. Of course, it's an abstract sculpture. One might think of Ron Kuzi or something like that. But the Chinese regard it as the shape of the mountain, particularly the Taihu Isle of the Immortals. They think, well, how does it look like a mountain? Well, again, turning to a painting in the Nelson, this particular painting by Wang Yun from 1699 represents the Taihu Isle of the Immortals. And you see it's kind of a balloon-shaped peak, constricted waist at the bottom, a point at the top, and then expanding sides at the middle. In the painting, you see that the island, of course, it's mysterious, it is sort of magical, but it's believed to rise in the East Sea, to the east of Jiangsu province, for example. So it rises out of the sea. When we take a close look and put them side by side, we see that the shape of this rock is very similar to the Wang Yun painting, and the rock stands on a wooden base that's carved to suggest rolling waves. So once again, the pairing is very, very close. But it works both ways. This quote from Liang Tu, a 19th century connoisseur, said that in collecting, it is the choice of rocks that comes first. If the rock is not seen like a painting by the powers of nature, then you shouldn't choose it. Now, that is to say that while rocks might inspire paintings, paintings can also inspire the choice of a rock as one wants for one's collection. And this one sets out right from the beginning that these are not rocks that one finds in nature on one's own or seeks out and then prepares as a solid rock. No, the Chinese regarded Chinese scholars' rocks in the realm of antiquities. So, as we will see during the course of the lecture, they are placed on wooden slate stands, like a fine jade, like an ancient bronze, or like a fine ceramic piece. So that they're in that category. And so the choice, he is speaking about the choice of the rock in an antique gallery, not going out to find a rock in nature. Now, if we look for deeper meanings, as opposed to just the semblance to a mountain or to a dancing figure, first of all, if there is a rock in a painting, it tells us something about the setting. It is not simply a vast expanse of land, just the wild nature, if you will. No, if there's a rock in the painting, it means that it's in a garden. Now, the garden might be a small, formal garden, or it might be a vast amount of territory, a royal forest, if you will, where the inhabitants of the associated palace might ride, as you see here, the prince is riding on a spring excursion, or they might go hunting. In that sense, in the Western tradition, one might compare this kind of setting to the royal forests around the palace or chateau at Fontainebleau, to the southeast of Paris, with the vast woodlands there. Now, so it tells us the setting. It tells us that it's a garden. It's not just a landscape, it's a garden, or at least a protected territory. In addition, it speaks to the status of any individuals that appear in the painting. It means that they're a very elevated status. These are princes. In other cases, it indicates that they are from the elite, if not princes, at least from the educated elite. They are scholars, they are scholar officials. And so it has that meaning as well. This painting is a little bit difficult to read in the with the full painting. It's an old painting, obviously, dating back almost 1,000 years, and it's sort of darkened. But you'll see it's a narrative figure painting, and here's a close-up where it appears a little bit brighter. The story itself dates back to the Han Dynasty, nearly 1,000 years, or 1,000 years or more after, before the painting was actually done. But we won't go deeply into the story, but it has to do with a minister on the left in the black robe who had the temerity to tell the emperor that he was wrong. And the ensuing story, finally, the emperor Taihu realizes the error of his own ways, forgives him, and makes him stay on. So you have a confrontation, if you will, between the emperor on the right, the seated, and the loyal minister on the left in the black robe who is standing. Now, each one stands before a rock, so you know these are important figures. It's slightly hierarchical, hard to see in this detail, but the rock behind the emperor is a little bit grander, ever so slightly taller than that before the loyal minister Taihu. The most important difference in terms of the status of signaling minister and emperor is that the rock behind the emperor is seated, if you will, in a large marble base, whereas the rock behind Taihu rests directly on the ground. And so you see there's all kinds of implied meanings in these paintings that are conveyed semiotically, if you will, by rocks associated with them. Now, this is about the same period, a completely different circumstance. This is the interior of a brick tomb that was excavated in 2016. The tomb itself dates to 1182, and the walls, the interior walls of the tomb were painted. So we have the date for the tomb. There was no funerary epitaph or funerary, so we don't know the names of the occupants. But the occupants are pictured on the walls, as you see here, facing each other, a husband and wife. Here is a painting of the man on the left, presented as if he were an official, whether or not he was, but certainly to have a tomb like that, he has to have been very wealthy. So he could have been an official in the government. He sits in a horseshoe-back chair with a cloth draped over the back of it. He sits behind the desk, and behind him is a fixed-frame screen with the landscape painted. To the right, you see that there is a garden rock. And we know it's a garden rock rather than interior because of the balustrade, which is defining the limits of the garden. And you see a banana palm tree to left. When we look at the painting of his wife, she's also in a nice chair with a cover draped over the chair. She sits behind the desk, again in front of a fixed frame screen. And once again, there was a scholar's rock there. Now, it's not so frequently that we see paintings of garden rocks or scholar's rocks either way in tombs. But the very fact that the rocks are there in these paintings indicates that the tomb occupants, before their death and having the tomb designed, wanted to take every symbol that they could to show that they were of elevated status, that they were cultured individuals, and that the rocks are, in that sense, very important symbols in a painting like that. The archaeologists who excavated the tomb said that they don't really know exactly what is on the table or guess before the figures. They said it seems on the two longer trays, they might be peaches or other fruits, peaches being a symbol of immortality in China, would be very appropriate, or they might be pastries. And then between those two longer trays, there is an elliptical cup, presumably in ceramicware, or perhaps silver or gold, placed on a stand. Moving on, Ming Dynasty. Here is a scholar official, but not, of course, in scholars' robes. I'm sorry, in officials' robes, but in scholars' robes, sitting at a table is going to play the qin, the classical Chinese musical instrument. You don't see the qin itself; it's still wrapped. And this little, somehow it went there. This little servant is going to unwrap the qin, which is wrapped in the fabric down here. Moving on to that detail, you see that the scholar is the most important figure, has this wonderful, beautiful rock directly behind him. Once again, signaling moral authority, if you will, very cultivated gentleman. And not only is it a beautiful rock, but it's set in a marble base, indicating that he is indeed a very, very wealthy gentleman. Now, in more humble circumstances, but still, to have a garden like this with the balustrade, and to be able to sit outdoors on a summer day, enjoying one's collected antiquities, it's certainly a wealthy fellow, as you see in this painting from the 13th century. Here I've blown it up a little bit, and you can see the figure sitting there, perhaps with his wife. To the right is a beautiful rock. Not only is it beautiful, but there's the balustrade, once again, providing the setting and indicating the very elevated stance of the gentleman in the painting. Now we see that the rock sits directly on the ground, like I say, in a more humble setting there. Or here's a rock by Ying, a very famous painter from the end of the Ming Dynasty and the beginning of the Qing. This one has no setting at all, but this is a rock that very possibly has political overtones. That is to say, the red color of the rock is unusual, and the way that some early Qing painters would paint bamboo, Jin comes to mind, for example, that some of them would paint bamboo in red. It seems that Ying has painted this in red to symbolize solidarity with the fallen Ming dynasty. The family name of the Ming emperor, the Ming imperial family, was Zhu, which means red. Here, different characters used for red in the painting's official title, but still, the fact that they would use the color red often symbolized loyalties to the previous dynasty, disguised dislike of the new Manchu Qing dynasty. So all kinds of symbolism come into these paintings. Now, as I mentioned, despite the meaning, that is a peak, a mountain, or symbolizing a setting and the status, most of all, these are simply abstract works of art. One might compare it to Henry Moore, to Alberto Giacometti, the painting realm of Jackson Pollock, to Franz Klein, something like that. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps because of the abstract nature of the Chinese writing system with Chinese characters and calligraphy. Perhaps because of that, but for whatever reason, the Chinese had a much earlier appreciation for an understanding of abstract than we did here in the West. And so we have this taste for abstraction in literati painting. From the Yuan dynasty forward, that is to say, from the late 13th and 14th centuries down to the present, just as we find this interesting abstraction in the rocks. Now, in terms of terminology, if you're curious about that, as if you know Chinese or studying Chinese art, The traditional terms for fantastic rocks are T-shirt, Y-shirt, and E-shirt, as I mentioned here, all of which refer to rocks of strange or unusual form. But each of those terms has the added connotation of interesting, wonderful, and very special. So the name is usually translated as fantastic rock.
Bob, excuse me, Bob. Sorry to interrupt. We're having trouble with the sound. I hesitated to interrupt, but it's continuing. I'm wondering, are your hands over your laptop in some way as you're speaking that might be obstructing the microphone?
No, my hands aren't there. Let's see. I just pulled it closer. Maybe that would help. Does that help at all?
It's still kind of it's muffled and wavy. It comes in and out.
Oh, I don't know why. Is there anything, a technical person there? Is there anything I can do?
Let me see if I mute you. And then can you turn your mic back? Okay, now try.
Okay, is it better now?
No, I'm afraid it's not. We may just have to live with it. I'm sorry to interrupt, but sometimes
not at all. If you think of something I can do,
don't hesitate to interrupt. I have never had this problem with a Zoom lecture before, so I don't know what the problem is or how to solve it.
Yeah, yeah, it's persisting. So maybe, I mean, if our audience would bear with us, if you want to exit the Zoom and come back in and see if that solves it, I think it would be worth taking a minute to do that.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone out there in YouTube land. We certainly appreciate your patience.
okay, are you there?
Yes, your audio sounds good now. Let's hope it continues. So
Okay,
sorry,
well, that's good news. Now, it says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing, so I need your help to get back in.
Try now.
I think you should have it now.
There it is.
Thank you, Bob. Again, sorry to interrupt, but the audio is good now. So lesson
Well,
learned.
that's good. It must have been some connection issue. Okay, so we're ready to go again?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Okay, we were talking about traditional terms. In traditional times, which is to say before the 20th century, there was not a real differentiation between garden rocks and scholars rocks. They were just all referred to as fantastic rocks. And if someone was speaking about them in person or writing about them in a book, you knew from the context which they were talking about. In the 20th century, particularly from the mid 20th century onward, there are specific terms for garden rocks and scholars rocks. Garden rocks often referred to as Yuan Li Feng, or upright peaks for the garden, sometimes referred to as Taihu Shi. Of course, Taihu refers to a specific type of rock, but it is sometimes used generically, as we might say Kleenex or Frigidaire or something like that, when another brand is involved. For scholars rocks, they're elegantly called Wenfang Yashi, or elegant stones for the scholar's studio. The most common term recently is gongshi, or presentation stones, shangshi, stones for appreciation, or lingshi. And that has been wrongly, I think, translated as spirit stones, wrongly in the sense that Lingshi is a contraction of Lingbi Shi. Lingbi is a place name and refers to a specific type of rock, in the same way that Taihu Shi might be used to refer generically to a garden rock. Lingshi is sort of being used generically to refer to scholars rocks. Now, there were famous rocks throughout Chinese history. Most of them have disappeared, well, at least since the Song dynasty, since the 11th, 12th century. One of the most famous, which has completely disappeared, but it's this rock known as the Chouchi stone. There's a little bit of detail about the ink, but here you can see it in full view. A beautiful stone that was supposedly collected by the famous literati Su Shi during the Song dynasty in the 11th, beginning of the 12th century. What the stone actually looked like, we don't know, but this is Feng Yulu's idea of what it must have looked like. There were a number of essays on rocks written by Mi Fu and others during the Song dynasty, the most famous of which is Du Wan's Yunlin Shi Pu, or the Cloudy Forest Rock catalog. So from literary descriptions, we actually know a lot about rocks from the Song dynasty. There are also lots of stories about rocks, and the most famous story is probably apocryphal, and it probably was invented in the Ming dynasty, but it concerns the Song dynasty scholar, painter, calligrapher, connoisseur, Mi Fu. It's said that one day while he was strolling, he saw a rock more beautiful than any other rock he had ever seen. So he bowed before the rock, as you see him doing here, and addressed it as elder brother. And so that's become a very famous story, so famous that it's even been picked up in Korea, as you see in this late 19th century painting by Ho Ryun of Mi Fu bowing before a fantastic garden rock. Now, when we look to see how paintings are depicted, the characteristics of their depictions in paintings, we can look here. A garden rock, for example, in real life, whether now or in ancient times, they're usually relatively large. As you see here, they can be 5 feet tall, they can be 20 feet tall. Generally vertical in orientation, set directly in the ground, although as you see here, they might be buttressed and bolstered by some additional rocks on the ground at the base. The very best rocks, particularly through the Ming dynasty, were generally given pride of place in the setting, usually the garden, set against a whitewashed wall. It might be the whitewashed wall of a building, which the scholar studio faced, for example, or it might be the wall that encloses the garden, as you see here. In paintings, we see the same thing. We saw this before. The rock set directly in the ground, as you see in this detail, before the balustrade, and they're often associated with trees, sometimes with flowering plants and such. Now, other than being set directly in the ground, some rocks, particularly associated with a palace or with the home of a very wealthy individual, might be set in a marble basin, as we see here. And this is from the Summer Palace in Beijing. We saw this painting before of Zhu Yun breaking the balustrade, the painting from the 12th century, with the rock behind the emperor, again, standing in a beautiful white marble base. but also smaller rocks are sometimes placed on marble bases. Here are 3 rocks, a little trio of them set in a marble base here, but then there's this small rock over here. That's a fine rock that's set on a marble base, and which I show you in a detail here. That reminds us of a painting like this, where a rather grand rock, garden rock, has been displayed on a beautifully carved white marble base that you see there. Now, turning to scholars' rocks, we see many more garden rocks in paintings, but scholars' rocks do turn up. You have to look hard to find them, but they do turn up. In this painting in the Cleveland Museum by Xie Huan, from the first half of the 15th century, we see that a group of scholars are gathered in this rather grand garden, some of them walking along a nicely paved path, but the focus is the pavilion here. With scholars there, and when we look inside the pavilion, one scholar is either painting or writing calligraphy, and if you look on the table behind them, you see a scholar's rock set on the table. We'll come back to that in a little bit, but here's a modern painting. So these occur in modern as well as old paintings. This one from 1962 and by Fu Baoshi. It is an imaginary portrait of the Ming painter Xiaomi. But when we look closely at this, you see the scholar's rock over on the windowsill, not playing a major role in the painting, but certainly indicating the elevated status of the painter, that is Xiaomi, who is depicted in the painting. It's the type of rock that you see here, and put them side by side, and while it's not a portrait of that rock, if you will, nonetheless, the similarity is quite striking. Now, of course, there are also depictions of collected rocks that were actual rocks whose portrait someone painted. This is a very famous, one of the most famous paintings or portraits of a rock, this one done by the Emperor Huizong during the first quarter of the 12th century, and it's one of the prizes of the Palace Museum in Beijing. It's known as the auspicious dragon rock, or Xianglong Shi Tu. Here's a close-up. This is a little bit of damage to the painting that's been repaired. Remember, it's just around 1,000 years old. But you see how beautifully the rock has been painted, but also all of the texture strokes used throughout, so that the perforations, the hollows and cavities are indicated, but also the dimpling and other texturing of the rock. It's an essential component of these rocks. It's not just any rock. You have to collect just the right rocks, and this shows elements that go into that. Alongside Huizong's painting of the auspicious dragon rock, this is another of the most famous paintings of rocks. Now, we don't know whether this was a scholar's rock or whether it was a garden rock, because no setting is indicated. But it's a very long hand scroll. It's also a very tall hand scroll, which is hard to sense here in the slide. But it is 10 different sections, each one with a different view of the same rock. And so this particular view gives you the basic frontal image of the rock from its best vantage point. The rock is lost; it's no longer known, but the painting is very, very famous, and some of you may have watched it sell in China some months ago. Or in modern times, many of you are familiar with the works of Liu Dan, who is famous for landscape paintings, for paintings of poppies and such, but he also has paintings of rocks. This one is in the Harvard Art Museums. It's interesting because here is a fan painting done by a young artist in China, in Tianjin, at the Tianjin Academy of Art, who has never seen the rock and who's never seen Liu Dan's painting. But from an image on the museum's website, he has painted an image of that particular rock. And I show them in tandem here. Now, one of the most famous scholars' rocks known now is the so-called Honorable Old Man rock, probably dates to the 17th century, and called the Honorable Old Man. It seems to be an elderly man standing in profile, rather humble with ragged clothes. This is his head, his neck, his nose, his chin, and a little beard. And he has his hands raised, almost unclasped together, almost up to his chin, as if in prayer. Now, the reason I bring this up here is that in 2010, Liu Dan did a series inspired by Wu Bin's 10 views of that Lingbi rock. Liu Dan did 10 views of this particular Honorable Old Man rock. Some of you may have seen the exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, opened in late 2010 and continued into early 2011, called Fresh Ink, and showing works by several contemporary Chinese artists in associations with works in the museum collection, or at least in the Boston area, that inspired the contemporary works. And so here is the Old Man rock, and here are most of Liu Dan's paintings showing it from different points of view. Here's the same thing from a different point of view. And here's the Old Man rock with a single painting that captures this particular view of that rock. So the rocks are not only important in their own right, but they are the subject in many ways of paintings, whether of portraits like this or integrated into other paintings. Now, where did this interest in rocks come from? Well, the short, honest answer is we don't know for sure. What we can say is that the Chinese have had an interest in fine stones, particularly in jade, since Neolithic times. Now, this particular jade is not Neolithic, dates from the Warring States period, 4th century BC. But nonetheless, jade is a very, very hard stone. It is very difficult to work. And the fact that the Chinese showered so much time and attention on working the stone shows their love for that type of stone. In addition, in traditional times, jade was considered more precious to the Chinese, that is to say, in Shang Dynasty, Zhou Dynasty, even down to the Han Dynasty, jade was considered more precious than bronze, than gold, or silver. So there was a real appreciation of fine stones, even if we don't find garden or scholars' rocks done in stone. By the Han Dynasty, of course, lacquer had come into its own, invented much earlier, but really come into its own, such that jade and lacquer together were considered the most expensive, the most precious materials. Another jade. Now, the first mention in historical records of rocks is not as collected stones per se, that is, as garden rocks or as scholars' rocks, but that they would gather stones, particularly in imperial gardens or the expanded gardens of a very wealthy household, and arrange them to simulate a range of mountains. Partly to view the range of mountains, so they had a range of mountains nearby without going to a more distant location. But as in the previously mentioned royal forests at Fontainebleau, they would stock them with wild animals, of course, with a fenced enclosure and everything, but stock them with wild animals so they could actually go hunting there. So that they were gathering rocks, assembling them together to create the semblance of a landscape with wild animals. And so whether this has anything to do with collecting rocks, we're not quite sure, but it does show gathering rocks and appreciating them in a certain way. Now, our first record of rocks in painting, at least that we're aware of, comes from this particular scroll. The original scroll, now lost, was painted in the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. This is a Song Dynasty copy, probably from the 11th, 12th century, something like that. The original painting and the copy records tribute. And of course, many states around China brought tribute to the emperor as a matter of goodwill, and hoping that being in the good graces of the Chinese emperor, China not only would not attack them, but they would receive gifts and benevolent treatment from the Chinese imperial court. So there were periodic arrivals of foreign envoys bearing tribute. And here in this scroll, there you see the envoy right here. He's again, hierarchical. He's the largest figure in the group. He's riding a horse. And lest anyone be uncertain, this particular servant holds a parasol over him, less to shade him or protect him from any rain than to signal from a distance. This is the important guy in the group. Now, when we look at details, there's the chief envoy again. See, there are all kinds of things, rare animals, a bird in a cage over here. And when we look here, we see that they're carrying what seem to be rocks, vertical rocks of a type that we will see a little bit later in Chinese painting. In this painting, and sometimes in the rocks themselves, they look a little bit like a saguaro cactus from the southwest. But in fact, so far as we know, from what we can tell in this depiction, they're actually stones. But when we look at here, we see not only the stones, but we see what seem to be scholars' rocks, by whatever name they were called then, set in a basin. So these are some of the earliest depictions of collected rocks in Chinese paintings. And there you get a close-up of the rock in the basin. Now, when we talk about types and modes of presentation, we've already said that the rock in combination with the tree and the balustrade back there indicates a very elevated setting. And the people in the scene are going to be very elevated people, in this case, royalty, in other cases, officials, emperors, scholars, and such. Occasionally, children turn up, as we see here, but once again, it would indicate that they're children in a very wealthy household that not only has a beautiful garden, a rock surrounded by peonies, but even tables, probably with an inset marble top and done with lacquer, black lacquer, inlaid with designs in mother of pearl. When we look at a rock like this, we see a certain similarity to ones like that. I don't mean to say it's the same type of rock or that the rock that we see in the painting was necessarily imported. Certainly by Ming times, they had found rocks like this in Sichuan province. And perhaps the rocks in the painting were sort of like that. I mean, in the Tong painting, sort of like this particular type of painting, or at least it was rocks of that type that inspired a love for this type of rock. Now, in most later Chinese paintings, the types of rocks that we see are the more elaborate form, but vertical rocks without perforations, but with a great deal of surface texturing, turn up in later paintings too, as you see in this painting by Li Shan. And particularly in Qing times, the rocks sometimes not only have plants growing beside them, but you might have a wisteria vine wrapping itself around the rock, but the same type of rock again. Now, in the Ming Dynasty, it's hard to know exactly in Song Dynasty, but in the Ming Dynasty, the rocks in the gardens were relatively sparse, so far as we know. And as I said, the principal rock would be given pride of place and set before a whitewashed wall of a building or of the wall that encloses the garden, as you see in this album leaf by Wen Zhengming here. When we move to the Qing Dynasty, however, we begin to see that the number of rocks is multiplying. There is a clump of rocks over here, I'll show you in a detail, and another one over here, and yet more rocks over here. Here is a pavilion in which a group of scholars are appreciating collected paintings there. But you see the rocks are of varying size, and some of them so large that they really cover up this little building here and this one over here. Whether it's a continuation of the same building or whether this is a small pavilion is difficult to tell. But you see the multiplication of rocks. What's happening, part of it's an aesthetic desire to increase the number of rocks, but another part is simply that as an old traditional garden was inherited by a succession of new owners, each new owner wanted to put his or her mark on the garden, and rather than rearranging the garden, which perhaps they sometimes did, they basically, excuse me, added the mark by adding more rocks. And so when you see here, Again, these rocks are basically the tall vertical stones like the ones that I've shown you before. Now, this manifests itself actually in the way gardens look. I showed you this rock before in isolation, the famous exquisite jade rock. In the Yuyuan in Shanghai, it's shown between two other rocks, as you see there. But when you look at the whole garden, there are areas where there's just the number of rocks is simply multiplied, as you see here. So that when you visit gardens in China, and you're told that they are Ming gardens. What that means, they were established, or the particular garden was established during the Ming Dynasty. It doesn't mean it looks the way it did in the Ming Dynasty. The Shanghai garden, of course, is much later. It's a Qing garden to begin with, or the gardens in the Forbidden City in Beijing. There must have been Ming type gardens there originally, but they don't look like that anymore. Now, the modes of presentation for scholars' rocks, the garden rocks we've looked at, as I mentioned, here's a detail from that offering scroll again, and you see this fellow, and the one down here, with what seem to be scholars' rocks in basins, presumably of metal, in this case, since it's going to be presented to the Emperor of China. Perhaps the basins are of gold. But here is Susher's famous Chochi stone again, seen as Fang Yulu interpreted it in this ink cake in the late Ming period. Now, what you see here, looking into the basin, it's probably a metal basin, who knows, probably bronze. The rock is set in there, but then it's held in place and kept in exactly the right orientation with little pebbles in the bowl, as you can see there. This continues. That was supposed, of course, it's a Ming work of art, the previous one, but it's supposed to represent a Song rock and its Song presentation. This is by Lu Zhi from the Ming Dynasty. It's dated to 1554, and you still have a rock set in a basin. It's probably perhaps Longchen Celadon, but more likely Junware. Probably some petals in the bottom, some water, and then acorus, a type of grass growing there. So it's set in this type of basin. Now, by the Ming Dynasty, of course, it was characteristic to present rocks on stands, but still, there was a subcategory of rocks that were presented in basins, like the one I just showed you, or even in Qing times of this Taihu stone presented in a planter, as you can see there. But by the 15th century, as we previously saw in the painting, most scholars' rocks for viewing indoors were shown on wooden stands. There are various styles of wooden stands, but most of them were shown on wooden stands. As you can see, as we saw before, and when we look up close, there is the rock on the table on a wooden stand. Now, this is a modern stand, but the rock on which that, the base on which that rock rests seems to be akin to the one that we see here. That's a brand new stand there. Now, where did the idea of the stands come from? Vis-a-vis rocks, at least. Well, first of all, most rocks, scholars' rocks that you're going to show indoors, require a stand to give the rock the proper orientation. The Chinese, because they wanted to believe, even if there had been some manipulation of the stone, they wanted to believe that nature had completely shaped the stone, that the hand of man had not been at work in shaping the stone, which means that many of the traditional scholars' rocks don't have a flat bottom, or some of those with a very slender waist, for example, come down to a point at the bottom. There's no way it could stand on its own. So you can have a rock on a stand, perfectly presented in terms of displaying the rock's best features, or without the stand, you can have a charmless lump. And so naturally, for just functional reasons, they use stands. But going beyond that, as I mentioned before, they wanted to think of every rock that they acquired and collected as being old, of having a history behind it, of having provenance behind it. They wanted to think of it as an antique. Therefore, they grouped their scholars' rocks together in their minds, at least, with collected jades, collected bronzes, collected ceramics, all of which since Song times have been displayed on wooden stands. Now, we don't know just where the idea of wooden stands came from. Of course, there is Buddhist deities have bases, whether in stone or whether gilt bronze. Perhaps there's some connection there. But by Song times, they were beginning to use stands. And that automatically sets the piece, whether a rock, a ceramic, an ancient bronze, it sets it apart from the mundane and marks it as very special. Treat it with care, respect it, and give it its due. Now, we see stands in painting. Again, one has to look very, very closely and look at many paintings to find them. But with the Ming Dynasty, they're there. Once again, a late 15th, early 16th century painting, a scholar or two scholars enjoying antiquities outdoors in a garden on a fine summer day. But when we look over here, and I'll show you two details, here and one more close up, you see that the bronze ding vessel is on a wooden stand, indicating that they were in use by then. And not only would they enjoy antiquities, but there would be music on the chin. And as in a previous painting, here is a long stringed chin that's wrapped up to protect it, being unwrapped so that they can enjoy music. Now, this is another painting by Xie Wan. The one we saw before is in the Cleveland Museum. This one is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Once again, you have an elegant gathering of scholars. Obviously, they're not only scholars, but scholar officials wearing official robes in a garden enjoying antiquities. And if we look closely here, you see that this vessel is set on a stand so that the rocks are being accorded the same treatment as antiquities. Another thing of interest regarding rocks, but a different type of rock, is the small screen there. It's much like this one that has marble with naturally colored markings that resemble a landscape. These are often referred to in English as dream stones. I'm not sure exactly where the name came from, but there it is. And so you see a screen like that in the painting. Now, of course, all of you at KU are familiar with the wonderful dreamstone landscapes in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Probably from two different sets, the two on the end from one set, the two in the middle from another set, but together they more or less represent landscapes of the four seasons. But again, completely natural except for the smoothing of the surface of the stone. Now, for types of rocks, moving on from just the aesthetics and depictions and paintings and such, the most famous type of rock is the Taihu rock, which comes from Lake Tai. Now, Lake Tai, to give you a location on this very, very general map, it's near Shanghai, but of course, in traditional times, Shanghai was a small village, not the grand city it is today. But near Suzhou, near Wuxi, Lake Tai is right here at the little point of the arrow. And rocks were collected from that lake. They had been collected since at least Tang times. What the Tang versions looked like, we don't know. But the written records tell us that already in the Tang times, they were collecting rocks, valued rocks from Lake Tai. Now, these are a relatively soft limestone. It's generally off-white to gray in color, and they have many perforations and interesting profiles. Apparently, in the Tang Dynasty, all of the shapes and the perforations came about naturally. That is, the waters of Lake Tai, at least at that time, were slightly acidic, which reacted with the limestone, which is calcium carbonate. But also, even more than the acidity of the lake, as the wind blew waves in the lake, the waves would move the sand on the bottom of the lake across the surface of the rock, creating holes in softer areas of the stone and giving the stone an ancient look. It was said that in Tang times and early Song times, that there were whole families that specialized in the cultivation, if you will, of Taihu stones. That is, the grandfather's generation would find rocks of the appropriate shape, general form, and such, put it into the lake. the son's generation would take care of tending to it to make sure that no one took it, that it was always well taken care of. And then finally, the grandson's generation would harvest the rock, by which point the holes would be there and the surface would have a wonderful weathered texture to it. It is said that by the Song dynasty, all such natural rocks were gone, and that everything was cultivated, if you will, and many of them were prepared with the holes drilled before the rocks went into the lake. There's no way to know for sure, but these are what the texts of the day tell us. Now, that's a garden rock, one set directly in the ground in the garden in Shanghai. This one in the Summer Palace near Beijing, set in a marble base. There are some scholars' rocks. There you see it set on a wooden stand, and it's the same type of stone. Sort of a creamy white limestone with all kinds of perforations, cavities, and a very interesting form that probably looks more like a dancing figure than a mountain peak. Or here's another one. One can imagine that it was probably shaped before it went into the water, but we'll never know for sure. But presented on a stand, and this is the kind of rock that without a stand wouldn't have any character at all. It has to have the stand to give it the proper orientation, to show it to proper advantage. And then in addition, the stand puts it in the realm of collected antiquities. Now, what I have to say is that even though the Taihu stones were the most popular and the most prevalent as garden rocks, they were not the most preferred as scholars' rocks. In fact, there was a whole hierarchy of scholars' rocks, and the Taihu stones were relatively far down on that list. The most prized stones for scholars' rocks were Lingbi stones. Lingbi is a place name. It's a county in northeastern Anhui province, there where the arrow is pointing. Now, these didn't come from lakes. In fact, the Lingbi stones, you've seen this one before, but the Lingbi stones basically came from caves underground. Once again, water was important, water in the caves that would help to shape them and give them a particular surface texture. Like Taihu rocks, they are limestone, but the best Lingbi stones are black, or such dark gray that they basically seem to be black. The Lingbi stone is a very, very dense limestone. If you strike a Lingbi stone, like this one, for example, if you were to take a little piece of metal and tap it at the top, it would have resonance. It would ring something like a bell, or the sound that you get if you tap a fine porcelain gently with metal. And so that's one of the prized characteristics of Lingbi stones. Occasionally, sets of stone chimes were carved from Lingbi stones. That's how resonant they were. But this one looks like a mountain, as we saw before with the Yuanzhang painting. And this is very typical of a Lingbi stone. The surface undulates, if you will, but it doesn't, the Lingbi stones don't usually have a lot of wrinkles or dimples over the surface. That is, they are not highly textured. The very best of them have a slight luster to them, as you see here. The Chinese refer to that as being wet. The stone is wet, as opposed to a stone with no luster at all. They generally refer to as being dry. This is a small scholars' rock in the form of twin mountain peaks, also Lingbi stone, and there you get a real sense of the surface of Lingbi stone, smooth but still with some texturing and a certain gloss or luster to the stone. This is also Lingbi, the very black stone. This is the same stone. You might not believe it, but it's the same stone shown on a different stand. This can be shown from 9 different vantage points, some looking like dancing figures, some looking like landscapes, but in different configurations and such. When we think of stones, we often think of just looking at it from one point of view, looking at it frontally, one vantage point. But traditionally, the best stones were considered to be beautiful both front and back. And the rarest were considered to be beautiful and interesting from every vantage point. This is the reason that you had Wu Bin painting the Lingbi rock from 10 different points of view. It was thought to be such a beautiful rock that he wanted to capture it from every single vantage point. Now, traditional scholars would say it's rare to find a rock that's beautiful both from the front and the back, and only 1 out of 100 rocks will be beautiful from every point of view. But these are some of the things that go into assessment of the quality of a rock. Here's a close-up of that particular rock where you sense something of the texture and the character of the stone itself. Now, the next most important type of collected scholars rock comes from Ying in Guangdong province. As a matter of fact, it's just some miles north of Guangzhou city. For those of you who knew Chu Li and perhaps knew his wife, Yao Wan, Yao Wan actually was from Yingda. When I talked to her about Yingda rocks, she said she'd never heard of Yingda rocks, didn't know anything about them. But she was born and grew up in Yingda. Of course, she spent most of her adult life in the States, and that was a tumultuous period. And so not too many people in China were worrying about rocks at that point. Now, this is typical Ying stone. Ying stone may have many openings, like this one does, may have few openings, may have no openings. By contrast, Lingbi stones seldom have perforations, as we see here. They sometimes do, but the Lingbi stone is usually black, is sometimes gray. The Ying stone is usually gray, seldom black. It often has overtones of brown, sort of a butterscotch color, as you see in that area. Has a very particular texture. Instead of being smooth with the occasional wrinkle, if you will, like Lingbi, it is usually punctuated with small dimples, small cavities all over the surface, as you see here. When you put the two side by side, this is typical of of Ying stone. This is typical of Lingbi stone. Kind of thing you can only get a general sense from photographs like this, but in handling a number of rocks, they fall into categories relatively quickly as you handle them. This is one of the most famous of modern contemporary Ying rocks. It's the Honorable Old Man that we have seen before. Records say that this goes back to the late Ming period. We have no way to prove it. There was a painting, supposedly a Ming or Qing painting, that's recorded in a modern copy, a 20th century copy, that if the original painting could be believed, was contemporaneous with this and was painting it or depicting it during the Ming Dynasty. Sadly, the original painting was lost. This particular rock was in China at the time of the Cultural Revolution. The owner at that time buried it. It was during that period that I am told that the Ming painting ended up being destroyed. So it survived the Cultural Revolution. It was unearthed. The Chinese government gave permission for the rock to be exported, and it was collected here in the Boston area by Richard Rosenblum. And it was he had already passed on by the time of the exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in 2010, 2011, but it was still in the family's possession. They lent it to the museum. Liu Dan made his 10 views of this particular rock. This rock has since been sold, and it's back in a collection in China, in a collection in Beijing. If you're interested in monetary value of this kind of thing, who knows what the rock is worth today? Richard Rosenblum told me that when he bought this rock, in the 1980s, that he paid $30,000 for it US. The family sold it to the collector in China for well more than $1 million. So it shows that like bronzes, like jades, like ceramics, the best of these rocks have tremendous value. Not all rocks do, but the best of them can have considerable value. This is another Ying stone in the form of multiple mountain peaks and with perforations that suggest the caves of the immortals, the abodes of the immortals, and things like that. And here you can get a very good idea of the dimpling of the surface of a Ying stone. Now, what I wanted to show you here, I mentioned before that often the underside of a Chinese scholar's rock is uneven. In Japan, where they also collect some rocks of this type, they would often cut the bottom of the rock so it was perfectly flat and then would sit atop a stand. In China, they would manipulate the stand to accommodate the irregularities on the underside of the rock. And so this is the stand for that particular rock. And, and you can see how the stand has been carved to accommodate the rock. The last type of rock, traditional type of rock that we will look at is the Chilean stone, which comes from the far northwest, from the Gansu corridor, Mount Chilean, which is more or less at the bottom point of that arrow. This rock you've seen several times. They tend to be gray, but often with caramel brown, as you see here. They often have perforations, sometimes they don't, but the real characteristic is that there will be layer after layer after layer of wrinkles, almost in concentric patterns, as you see in that particular area. Other areas would have configurations of wrinkles like that too, except with a perforation with that particular shape of the stone. You don't see it. You get hints of it down here. But this is a type of rock that came into fashion in the 17th century. So Lingbi was always the most popular, but Lingbi rocks were expensive. Sometimes it was difficult to get Lingbi stones, and so they would add other stones to the canon. That's how the Ying stones came to be added to the canon. During a period of shortage of Lingbi, they added Ying stone. In the 17th century, during a period of shortage during both Lingbi and Ying stones, they added Chilean stones to the canon. So it was an ever, if gradually, expanding canon, as we see here. And yet other types of gray stones were added too. Then in the Qing dynasty, particularly 18th and the 19th centuries, there was a embrace of color. This began in the Ming dynasty, but an embrace of color in all the arts of China. We see it in the taste for cloisonné enamel, in the taste for enameled porcelains, for example, and it expresses itself in scholars' rocks as well, with something like the hornblende stone that we saw before, or in malachite, which came to be prized. Its popularity never outshined that of Lingbi or Ying, but still it came to be an acceptable type of scholar's rock in certain circumstances. With malachite, you have both polished malachite, as we have here, and unpolished malachite, as we see here. Of course, it's the unpolished malachite that gives the greatest resemblance to a forested mountain with waterfalls and ravines, as you can see there. In the same way that they came to collect malachite, there are some scholars' rocks in azurite, as you see here, although these are very, very rare. Now, then in 20th and 21st century, we have new media, completely manufactured, of course, but it is a stainless steel rock done by John Wang. This is in the Harvard collections. The Metropolitan has one as well, identical. When the Harvard rock was made, which was number 3 out of an edition of 8, John Wang was hammering stainless steel over an existing scholar's rock. A very beautiful form. After he made this one, though, he realized that the rock was beginning to chip and to break. And so he took a mold of the rock and cast the mold in cement and made future additions down to number 8 by hammering the stainless steel over a concrete replica of the original rock. but it just shows you that there's an enduring taste for these rocks. There's an enduring taste to experiment with them, whether adding new stones to the canon or painting them like Liudon does, or forming them in stainless steel, as John Wang does. Now, this is the very last slide, and I just wanted to tell you some of the traditional Chinese criteria, aesthetic criteria for judging the quality of rocks. Of course, as with any set of criteria that was established 1,000 years ago, it holds for some things and not at all for others. But the four terms that you will hear over and over again in discussions of the aesthetics of Chinese rocks, whether scholars rocks or garden rocks, are shou, tou, lou, and zhou. Shou means thin, and it basically, in addition to meaning thin, it indicates that the rock should be vertical, not horizontal. Of course, there are horizontal rocks, but as you'll recall in thinking about the rocks we saw during the course of the lecture, most of them were vertical in orientation, and that's just the basic preferred shape. Sometimes, like the one behind the emperor in the Zhuyun breaking the balustrade painting, the central portion is vertical, and then there are two branches that kind of break off from it. Then the term tou, it means transparent or penetrable. It's not actually referring to the holes, rather it refers to the little hollows and what I was referring to as dimples over the surface of the stone that give it an interesting texture. The term that refers to the holes or apertures in the rock is lou, and it literally means hole or aperture. And those are preferred in many rocks, but we don't see them in every single rock. And then an important characteristic that for all of the limestone rocks, at least, not necessarily for malachite or hornblende, something like that, is zhou, which literally means wrinkles and refers to surface texture. And comparing it with painting, it's the equivalent of the texture strokes, the cuan or the cunfa, that we talk about in discussions of Chinese painting. So that brings us to the end of this Orient Express through the history of Chinese collected rocks. But I would just say that this is a tradition of collecting that has ancient origins, goes back at least 1,000 years and probably much more. It is very important. It was something that was associated with the elite. Whether the wealthy elite, but in most cases with those who were highly educated, who were scholars, who served as scholars officials. It wasn't something that was known to the general public in the same way that literati painting was not known to the general public or understood by the general public. This would be in the same realm as literati painting. Those who understood painting would understand rocks. Those who understood rocks would understand painting. And the pieces that is, the rocks take their place alongside other collected antiquities, whether jades, porcelains, bronzes, lacquers, and such. So it's a very ancient tradition, one that continues right down to the present, ever broadening and with ever new manifestations. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'll be happy to entertain them now.
Thank you, Bob. And here's Amy McNair to join the conversation.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. Sorry, David, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
That was terrific. What a blizzard of beautiful images you gave us, not only the rocks themselves, but depictions of rocks in art. And I just wanted to tell you that my Gardens of Japan and China class has been invited to your lecture today. So all the stuff that you said about garden rocks was, I'm sure they're lapping that up right now. So I'm going to turn to the...
I read that you're offering a course in Chinese and Japanese gardens this semester. So yeah. I intentionally stayed way away from talking about gardens, which I'm not qualified to talk about. I think I'm qualified to talk about rocks, but not about gardens. So I kept my my comments on gardens really to the point that I was making. So you can pick up here and elaborate on the gardens themselves.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You're an excellent introduction to that subject. I'm going to look at the chat box now. And let's see, Vidita says, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Mowry. Your discussion on the materiality of the rocks, their texture, dimpling, holes, wrinkles, etc., was inspiring. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about the role of rocks in terms of Jing, as in views or scenes, both physically but also in paintings.
Some of you probably know that there is a separate art form that derives from the Scholars Rock tradition, particularly rocks in a basin, that is called punjing, and is sometimes translated as tray or basin landscape. Where you have a scholar's rock or a type of scholar's rock that is set in a basin. This is today, whether it's a ceramic basin or sometimes it's a marble basin meant to go on a table. And so there will be the rock. Often there will be some water in the bottom of the basin. And they will also plant grasses, as you saw in the Luger painting of the rock in the bulb bowl. Or in some cases, they will put a bonsai planted on the rock itself. And in some cases, they expand them in a very mundane fashion into something that looks like a model train set with bridges and all kinds of things like that. But like I say, it's something that has purely modern, but it's something that's come off from the basin type of landscape, scholar's rock, referred to as a punjing or basin landscape. So there is that connection. I don't fully understand exactly what else the questioner wanted to know about.
Well, she has a kind of a part two here. She says, especially as rocks in gardens would evolve and change over time with nature, while those represented in paintings would not.
Oh, that's a very interesting question.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, of course, the Taihu rocks are limestone, and in the same way that they were weathered, if you will, while they were underwater in Lake Tai, of course, wind blowing sand, the action of rain, particularly in modern times of acid rain and things like that, certainly would change the appearance of the rock. I have the feeling, and of course, people touching the rock, children playing in the gardens and things like that, all kinds of things are going to change. I have the feeling that the large, well-known rocks probably don't change that much over time, although a rock that has appendages that branch out, if you will, those surely get broken over time. And whether they're simply left the way they are after the damage occurred, or whether someone takes a chisel and such and reshapes the stone, I'm not quite sure. I haven't looked into that aspect. My work has been more on scholars rocks and more general on garden rocks, and so I hadn't thought about that. But it's an excellent question, and of course they do change to a greater or lesser extent due to exposure outdoors.
Yeah. I have a question here from Wei Tian. He asks, thanks for the fabulous presentation. Could you talk a little bit more about the kind of sensory experience with rocks or garden stones, things like sound and touch and that sort of thing?
Yes, it's very important. I think probably less so with the garden rocks, but more so with the scholars rocks. As I mentioned with Lingbi rocks, it is a very, very dense kind of limestone. It's not something we usually think about. The first time I struck, gently, I will add, the first time I struck a Lingbi rock and heard the sound, I was convinced it must be a meteorite or something like that, rather than limestone, because it had a very strong resonance to it, just as I mentioned, as if you had tapped a porcelain on a bell-like ring. But on doing research and for the exhibition catalog that I did, I not only did a lot of looking and research into traditional sources, but we also did a great deal of scientific testing in the museum's analytical laboratory. And they indeed are limestone. It's just the way it formed. It formed very, very, very densely. And I mentioned that in a few cases, sets of chimes were made out, chimes for musical chimes, were made out of Lingbi stone. So the very best of them do have a very beautiful sound to them. Ying stone can be rather dense and can have a stone. It's something that one expects in Lingbi. If Lingbi, a particular Lingbi rock does not have a strong resonance, then it's not a desirable stone. Ying may have a resonance, but it's not. It's desirable, but it's not required. In terms of touching them, I think many traditional scholars enjoyed touching the rocks, feeling the smooth surfaces of the Lingbi, feeling the dimpled surfaces, the wrinkled surfaces of Chilean stones and such. So that it was an important feature in collecting and enjoying the rocks.
Yes, I would imagine that. We have a question here from Ying. She writes, "Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I wonder who decides the value of the stones. Besides the 4 aesthetic criteria for judging rocks, does color add value to the stone?"
Yes, of course. There are other characteristics. I just gave these 4 basic characteristics that, like I say, were identified as desirable characteristics and then codified, identified in the Tong, and then codified in the Song by Ming and certainly by Qing times. A number of other characteristics had been added. Color is one of them, so that in Lingbi, one wants it to be black. If there are a few streaks of white calcite running through it, that's fine, particularly if they're along the top and suggest a snow-capped peak. On the other hand, if the rock is half white, a Lingbi rock is half white and half black, it's not so desirable. With the Ying stone, the darker it is, the better. Although if it has some shades of brown, that's fine too. The same thing, they're just a range of colors that is acceptable. Other characteristics include they want the rock to be old, and so the term Jiu is used, just meaning old. But beyond being old, they also associate it with Gu or ancient, the difference between old and antique. Something can be old, but not necessarily desirable. Whereas an antiquity, meaning that it is a valuable old piece with a distinguished heritage and provenance. So Jiu and Gu are also there. And so color, shape of the rock, all kind of, not so many things were added to the list of criteria, but certainly by late Ming, a number of other features had been added, yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Ying is asking about that because she's interested in color and antiquarianism in late Ming times. So I know that's why she asked that question. Can I slip in a question that I have?
Just to go back to that point. Oh dear, it slips my mind at the moment. The young scholar of Chinese art now teaching at Yale. I can't think of his name. Quincy. Yes, Quincy. You must be familiar with his studies on the use of malachite and azurite in painting.
Yes.
But also collecting azurite and malachite, partly as scholars' rocks, but partly for all kinds of other scientific and medicinal purposes, if you will. So I'm sure you know the work, but definitely look into Quincy's work.
I think that Ying has got his dissertation and his book should be coming along in a couple of years, so we'll look for that. Here's my question.
Well, he has a couple of articles out. Good.
Okay,
I can send them to you if you want.
Okay.
I have both of them in PDF format. Yes, recent articles.
Okay, swell. I would love that. So here's my question, and if you don't know the answer, that's okay. I saw the Wu Bin scroll, the 10 views of Lingbi stone in Los Angeles before it was sent back to be sold. And I'm very curious, do you know who bought it?
No,
Okay.
I don't. It's not public knowledge. I'm not holding back. I simply don't know.
Okay.
The owner seems to have wanted to keep it secret. At the time that we did the Worlds Within Worlds exhibition at Harvard, I borrowed the scroll. We were the first ones allowed to show it publicly after the sale at Sotheby's, when the then owner bought it. I've forgotten when the owner bought it, but late 80s, 88, I think, 87, 88, I think. And then we, after much negotiation and much behind the scenes wrangling, all this and that, we were finally able to borrow it. We didn't show it to best advantage, I'm sorry to say, because we were given exactly 1 week's notice that we could borrow it. And then we had to get it from New York up to Cambridge. and figure out where we were going to put it, because we assumed we weren't getting it. And so we didn't really come up with a plan B until the last minute. Anyway, we did show it, but we were only able to show the first section, which I showed here in the slide, the frontal view of the best view.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Eileen Wong has checked in with a question. She says, thank you for sharing your research. Dr. Mowry, in what kinds of contexts do you find discussions of scholar rocks in literature? Did any writer discuss why rocks should be highly valued?
It has to do with in Song times, it's difficult to know for sure in Song times, but certainly by Ming times, it has to do with literati values. It has to do with the relationship to painting. And the best I can say off the top of my head, it's a very important question. It's also a difficult question to answer. Again, at the end of a lecture, my mind goes blank. What is the name of Wu Hong's wife?
Judy Zeitlin.
Yes, Judy Zeitlin. Judy Zeitlin has some articles and a book. An article in which she discusses one particular stone not from an art historical point of view, from the point of view of literature and a fanciful biography of the stone, if you will. And then she also has a book that treats subject like this. And so I would refer you to Judith Zeitlin's book. You can look it up easily. If not, I have it in my records. I can send that to you as well.
Okay.
I don't think I have a PDF of the article, but
no, I know the one you mean, Bob. I didn't think of that, but I've actually assigned that in the past in seminar, and it's quite good, quite good.
Yes, I think for general reading, well, it's not general, but instead of a specific scholarly study, I think that would probably address the point very well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to let you stand down now, sir. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. We all enjoyed it very much, and I know I'll be having more discussions with my students about what you had to say. And we just really want to thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. It's been really illuminating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I'm just sorry I couldn't be there.
Yeah.
Next time.
Next time. That's exactly right. Next time. Yes. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for bearing with us with the audio issue, but we solved it. And Bob, thank you again. And we do look forward to welcoming you back to Kansas in person in the future. And until then, we'll just wish everyone a good night.
Thank you. I look forward to visiting again soon. And one last question, not art historical at all. Were there any more glitches whatsoever with the sound?
No, it was perfect.
No, it's fine.
Okay, I guess if that ever happens again, we just need to close Zoom and reopen it, relaunch the connection, and start over.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I'm glad it went well from there on.
Yeah, it's great.
All right. So
thanks, Bob.